Few events in the annals of combat sports capture the brutal spectacle and fortitude of 19th century pugilism like the 1893 showdown between Andy Bowen and Jack Burke. Taking place at New Orleans' Olympic Club on April 6 to 7, 1893, the fight has gained near-mythic status not for the presence of high-profile champions such as John L. Sullivan or James J. Corbett, but for its remarkable length. 110 rounds spread across more than 7 hours of non-stop action. Taking place at a time when the Marquess of Queensberry Rules were gradually being standardized, this extended bout both thrilled spectators and underscored the dire need for more stringent regulations in a sport that was flirting with dangerous extremes. Beyond the mere record books, the Bowen-Burke contest left an indelible imprint on boxing's cultural narrative, sparking debate on issues of fighter safety, sportsmanship, and the commercial forces that fueled prize fights in the late 19th century. Andy Bowen. Born in New Orleans, Louisiana, on May 3, 1867, Andy Bowen rose from a relatively modest background. Living in a city famous for its love of contests, ranging from horse racing to bare-knuckle brawls, Bowen gravitated toward boxing, a pursuit that was both physically and financially appealing. Although somewhat overshadowed by contemporaries who vied for national or world titles, Bowen earned a regional reputation by the late 1880s for his quick footwork, defensive instincts, and durable constitution. Bowen's rise to prominence in New Orleans made him a local favorite. Reports from local newspapers, such as the New Orleans Times-Picayune, often praised his courage and grit, noting that he was difficult to knock down or wear out. His style combined a spirited defense with bursts of aggression, a combination that was especially effective in an era when fights could last dozens of rounds. Above all, Bowen was known for resilience. He could absorb significant punishment and continue to fight, which would become a crucial element of his near-legendary endurance in the ring. Barely a year after his epic marathon with Burke, Bowen succumbed to injuries sustained in a match against George "Kid" Levine on December 15, 1894. His death highlighted the perils boxers faced at a time when medical oversight and safety protocols were rudimentary, if present at all. Jack Burke. Contrary to Andy Bowen's locally celebrated status, Jack Burke was less well known before 1893. Believed to be of Irish-American descent, Burke had fought across various local circuits, honing a gritty, stamina-oriented style. While not exceptionally tall or powerful for a lightweight, Burke compensated through tenacity and the ability to capitalize on opponents' lapses in concentration over many rounds. He demonstrated bulldog persistence that matched Bowen's own stout heart. Burke's approach revolved around steady, relentless pressure, particularly focusing on the midsection. He often eschewed flashy combinations for a simpler, attritional game plan, allowing him to conserve energy across numerous rounds. Though he never attained star status and was overshadowed by Andy Bowen's subsequent fatal bout, Burke's name became etched into boxing lore by virtue of a single fight whose length remains unprecedented under modern gloved rules. The 1893 fight, scheduled for April 6, 1893, and lasting until the early morning hours of April 7th, the match took place at the Olympic Club in New Orleans. The club had hosted numerous high-profile prize fights, thanks in part to the relatively lax regulatory environment in Louisiana compared to many other states. Prize fighting was in a transitional phase at the time. The modern Marquess of Queensberry Rules, which mandated the use of gloves and 3-minute rounds, were still being adopted in various localities. Boxing was simultaneously embraced and reviled during the late 19th century. On one hand, the sport was celebrated by enthusiasts as a proving ground for masculine virtue, courage, and skill. On the other, moral reformers criticized it as dangerously violent and ripe for exploitation by gamblers. New Orleans, with its cultural tolerance for gambling and public spectacle, emerged as a hotbed for matches that often ran well beyond what modern observers would consider safe. One of the most startling features of the Bowen-Burke encounter was its extraordinary duration. The two fighters went at each other for 110 rounds across more than 7 hours. The round structure, in compliance with Queensberry rules, stipulated 3-minute intervals, although timekeeping was less precise than in modern bouts. Over time, each fighter became severely fatigued and battered. Contemporary newspaper accounts described moments when both men could scarcely raise their arms, emphasizing that each blow lacked the crispness or speed seen in earlier rounds. According to the New Orleans Times-Picayune, by the 70th round, the crowd itself grew restless and uncertain whether the fight would ever find a conclusive end. Blurring of lines between endurance and bravado. Typically, in that era, referees hesitated to stop fights prematurely, fearing accusations of bias or incompetence. A knockout or a corner stoppage was the common way to end a match. In the Bowen-Burke slugfest, however, neither fighter managed to land a decisive blow, nor did either corner throw in the towel, which allowed this historical war of attrition to drag on. Declared a no contest. After 110 rounds, the referee ended the fight without naming a victor. While modern boxing rules might have eventually forced a technical decision based on points, those provisions were not universally observed in 1893. Both men were effectively incapacitated from sheer exhaustion. Local fans and sports writers were torn between admiration and shock. Many hailed the perseverance shown by both boxers, dubbing the clash the greatest display of staying power in ring history. Yet the fight also sparked outrage in some quarters, as critics decried it as an inhumane spectacle and a clear demonstration of the sport's glaring need for stricter oversight. The astonishing brutality and duration of the Bowen-Burke contest did not single-handedly transform boxing regulations overnight. Nonetheless, it contributed to a broader conversation that was already underway regarding fighter safety, uniformity of rules, and the commercial aspects of prizefighting. Newspapers across the United States commented on the fight, adding fuel to debates about protecting fighters from grievous harm. Prominent editorials pointed out that boxing could swiftly lose moral and public support if similarly endless contests were permitted to continue. Gradual introduction of round limits. Over the coming decades, athletic commissions and boxing organizations increasingly codified round limits, eventually settling for fewer rounds, initially 15 for championship fights, and later 12 in the modern era. Historians credit the negative publicity from marathon bouts like Bowen-Burke as a catalyst for these evolving standards. Legacy of the fighters themselves. Andy Bowen's mortal fate. Already tested to his limits in the Burke fight, Bowen would lose his life just a year later in a match against Kid Levine. This tragic event magnified the seriousness of ongoing concerns about head trauma and safety protocols, though thorough medical care for boxers would remain scarce for many more decades. Jack Burke's obscurity. While Jack Burke's name is forever linked to one of the most memorable bouts in boxing history, he did not parlay that fame into a celebrated career. He remained an itinerant prizefighter, earning decent but not spectacular purses, and gradually faded from the spotlight, overshadowed in part by the increasingly sensational accounts of Bowen's demise. Modern fans are often surprised by the severity of pre-20th century boxing, a time when fights could last until one man was knocked senseless or irreversibly exhausted. The Bowen-Burke Marathon epitomized this culture, one that idolized near-superhuman endurance while maintaining minimal concern for physical well-being. By the consensus of most reputable historical sources, the Bowen-Burke fight holds the distinction of being the longest recorded gloved match under, at least nominal, Queensberry rules. In contrast, bare-knuckle bouts of the same period or earlier, under the London prize ring rules, sometimes exceeded 100 rounds as well, but those were generally marked by rest periods, different rules for a round's duration, or different criteria for ending a round. As grisly as it was, the fight served as an unforgettable harbinger that the sport needed more structure: time limits, glove standards, referee intervention, and eventually, medical checks. Early reforms were typically championed by civic leaders, medical professionals, and sports journalists who worried about the human cost of unregulated prize fights. Beyond safety and regulation, the Bowen-Burke bout opens a window into the socio-economic climate of the late 19th century. Prizefighting was, for many working-class men, one of the few means to escape labor-intensive jobs for the promise of a quick payday, even if it came with broken bones and battered bodies. Both Bowen and Burke, neither of whom hailed from affluent backgrounds, illustrate how the sport attracted men willing to risk their health for fame and a share of the gambling proceeds that fueled boxing events. The Olympic Club, like many venues in New Orleans, profited handsomely from gate receipts and side wagers on round outcomes. The length of the Bowen-Burke fight, in fact, led to complicated scenarios for gamblers who had placed bets on which round the match would end. Some ended up losing large sums simply because the contest outlived their prognostications by dozens of rounds. With newspapers engaging in sensationalist reporting, the fight captured the public imagination beyond New Orleans. While telegraph lines carried periodic updates to major cities, the spectacle of a never-ending fight only enhanced boxing's image as a test of extreme mettle, though it also galvanized moral critics. Public fascination existed side by side with moral condemnation. Clergymen, temperance groups, and certain civic leaders regarded the Bowen-Burke affair as a new low point in a violent subculture. To them, it was an example of human exploitation, wherein promoters, gamblers, and spectators enabled a prolonged, borderline inhumane duel. Subsequent discussions about establishing round caps and mandating physicians at ringside were in part a direct reaction to that moral outcry. The 1893 epic between Andy Bowen and Jack Burke at the Olympic Club in New Orleans remains a hallmark of boxing's early years under the Marquess of Queensberry Rules. Enduring an eye-watering 110 rounds over more than 7 hours, both men exhibited astonishing stamina and bravery, yet they also exemplified the fundamental lack of regulation that made such a marathon possible. The fight, declared a no contest when neither man could continue, immediately joined the sport's lore as the longest gloved match on record. In the immediate aftermath, praise for Bowen and Burke's fortitude mingled with public horror at the physical and emotional toll. Although comprehensive reforms to boxing's rule set would unfold only gradually over the coming decades, the Bowen-Burke contest remains a pivotal anecdote in the sport's evolution, a cautionary tale about sacrificing safety to spectacle and a stark reminder of the extremes fighters will endure to seek fortune and fame. Over 130 years later, historians, boxing aficionados, and casual sports fans alike continue to marvel at the extraordinary display of human will and to question the costs of pushing it